I don't know whether you've come across Richard Tice. In many ways, I wish I hadn't. Richard Tice is Brexit-lite. Richard Tice is Farage-lite. Richard Tice is also on GB News. And Richard Tice, like Farage, has found a media platform to air his views, his prejudice, his frankly rather brilliant presentational approach. But he is not as good as Farage. He is Farage-lite. And is he likely to do a deal with Rishi Sunak and ensure the next Conservative government, as Farage did a deal with Boris Johnson and ensured the 2019 election? Absolutely not. Richard Tice knows full well that his Reform UK cannot deliver anything of purpose to the Conservative Party. All it can do is detract. So now, I find it extraordinary trawling through the BBC today, the sort of stories which are simply speculative and pointless. And another pointless speculative story is that Richard Tice claims that the Conservatives are stealing his ideas. Well, it's absurd. There are two big ideas that he's putting forward. One is that net zero is a cult. I use that term very carefully because one shouldn't use the word cult too much when one's talking about anything to do with Jeremy Hunt, but cult it is, and it's become a sort of religion, he says. I agree entirely, and it's got its advocates, its priests, its ministers, and its devoted faithful. But it's way out there. It's unattainable at the moment. 2050 seems a long way off net zero. And so far, it's all about praying. So from that point of view, he's sort of right. It's too far away to be realistic to the majority of voters. Brexit, on the other hand, is done. Not done very well, but it is done. And the Reform UK party emerged from the Brexit party. That's the one where Anne Widdecombe was wittering on, and not very effectively. Brexit party really didn't do very well in the 2019 election, if you remember, but that's partly because it did its deal with the Conservative Party. This time, Reform is it's got seats everywhere. It's got. I think it's putting. It's going to fight every single seat in the next election. And so if you want to vote for Richard Tice, I suppose you can. He says that the three things that have dominated the Conservative Party at the moment are all three things that he wants. The net zero thing, the asylum policy, the critique of the UN Refugee Convention, therefore, by Suella Braverman. Well, that's something that any sensible person would put forward. I don't see that's particularly Reform UK. I've been championing the an international conference to reconsider the definition of the 1951 UN Refugee Convention. I'm not a member of Reform UK, and I'm not particularly opposed to migration. It's not an ideological stance that I take. In fact, I think we should be welcoming migration. I think we should be managing migration, but we should be welcoming it. We certainly shouldn't be dealing with people who have good reasons to claim to be migrants here, to claim asylum here. We certainly shouldn't be dealing with them as if they are lepers, which is how we are treating people. We certainly shouldn't be dealing with international students who we invite here as if they're some sort of disease to be fleeced and then thrown out, which we do. So we need to revise all of that, and all of that is partly motivated by an international conference on migration, on the way people travel from one country to another. That's an important conference to have. I think we should be convening that. It's something that we could do in the dying embers of the present Parliament, but I don't think it's something that is going to be done. Instead, I think Suella Braverman's approach will be to defy the 1951 Refugee Convention to defy the European Court of Human Rights and the European conventions and so on. And then he also thinks that the freeze on HS2, I was going to say the threes or the four. I'm not sure whether it's a freeze or whether it's a thaw. What the metaphor is, but they go slow on HS2. That's hardly a metaphor. That's simply a malignant indication of the way that British Rail seems to operate. But yes, he says that HS2 is something that isn't going to work, and it's a waste of money. It's a vanity project. He's picked that up from the language of UKIP. Whereas the United Nations Refugee Convention is outdated. That is a reasonable idea. The net zero, the 2050 target, is too far in the future, and it is seen as something esoteric, arcane, cultish, religious. And Tice and Farage bandy around together because they're both presenters of GB News. They're not politicians. They're not real politicians. They're news presenters. Let's face the facts. They're not politicians. If they were politicians, they would be in Westminster. They're not. They're play acting. And this fellow, Tice, looks towards looks at what he calls broken Britain. He says, the Conservatives have broken Britain, but Labour would bankrupt Britain. Well, I think he's rather misunderstood what Liz Truss was about, because Liz Truss was well on the way to bankrupting Britain. So he and Farage supporting Liz Truss is a bit ironic. But there we are. There we are. Tice wants to be seen to be important. The only way that he can be seen to be important on the national political stage is to claim that all the ideas of the Conservatives are actually his ideas. The ideas of the Conservatives at the moment are mad, so if they happen to be identified as being the ideas of Tice, fine, so be it. Actually, some of the ideas, certainly this review of the 1951 Refugee Convention is perfectly reasonable, and the HS2, perfectly reasonable to recognise it as a vanity project. But having committed to something, we should see it through, frankly. And the day for pulling out was in 2016. You don't pull out once you've already started.